Chapter 1. What was the Bronze Age? Around 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East contained some of the most sophisticated, interconnected civilizations the ancient world had yet produced. Kingdoms and empires linked through extensive trade, diplomacy, and shared technological knowledge, stretching from Greece to Egypt to Mesopotamia. This era, which historians call the Late Bronze Age, took its name from bronze itself, an alloy of copper and tin that had become absolutely essential for weapons, tools, and countless other purposes throughout these interconnected societies. This metal's production requiring genuinely complex international trade networks. Copper, while relatively available in certain regions including Cyprus, needed tin to create true bronze, and tin sources remained geographically limited and often quite distant, meaning virtually every major Bronze Age civilization depended on reliable long-distance trade simply to maintain their fundamental military and agricultural technology. This dependence created a remarkably interconnected ancient world, ships carrying copper, tin, and countless other goods across the Mediterranean, diplomatic messengers traveling between royal courts, and skilled craftsmen sometimes moving between kingdoms, creating genuine cultural and economic interdependence across vast distances. Major Bronze Age powers included Egypt, ruled by pharaohs controlling the Nile's remarkable agricultural wealth, the Hittite Empire dominating much of Anatolia, Mycenaean Greek kingdoms controlling the Aegean, and various Mesopotamian powers including Babylon and Assyria, each maintaining sophisticated administrative and military systems. These civilizations weren't merely neighbors, but genuine diplomatic partners, royal correspondents surviving from this period, revealing marriage alliances, trade agreements, and careful diplomatic protocol between kingdoms separated by hundreds or even thousands of miles of ancient travel distance. This sophisticated international system, sometimes called by modern historians a genuine international age, represented one of the ancient world's most impressive achievements, comparable in some ways to later, better documented periods of extensive international trade and diplomatic cooperation. Yet within just a few decades, around 1200 to 1150 BCE, this entire sophisticated system experienced catastrophic, near-total collapse. Major palace centers destroyed, international trade networks severed, and several of these powerful, ancient civilizations either vanishing entirely or falling into centuries of decline. Understanding what actually happened during this remarkable, rapid collapse remains one of ancient history's most genuinely fascinating, unsolved mysteries. Archaeologists and historians continuing to debate the precise causes even today, centuries after this dramatic transformation first captured serious scholarly attention. Chapter 2. The Interconnected World of 1200 BCE. To understand the Bronze Age collapse's true significance, we must first appreciate exactly how interconnected and sophisticated this ancient international system had genuinely become by the final decades of the 13th century BCE, shortly before everything began unraveling. Diplomatic correspondence, preserved in archives including the famous Amarna letters from Egypt, reveals kings addressing one another as brothers, exchanging lavish gifts, negotiating marriage alliances, and maintaining careful diplomatic protocol despite the genuinely vast distances separating their respective kingdoms. Trade routes connected this entire region through both overland caravans and, crucially, extensive maritime shipping, merchant vessels carrying copper from Cyprus, tin from distant sources possibly in Afghanistan or Britain, and countless other valuable goods across the eastern Mediterranean's busy shipping lanes. A remarkable shipwreck discovered near Uluburun, off the Turkish coast, dating to roughly this exact period, contained an extraordinary cargo, including copper and tin ingots, glass, ivory, and luxury goods from at least 7 different regions. This single vessel demonstrating this trade network's genuine sophistication and reach. Skilled craftsmen and specialized knowledge also travel between kingdoms, royal correspondents sometimes specifically requesting skilled physicians, artisans, or other specialists be sent between courts. This exchange of human expertise representing another crucial dimension of Bronze Age international connection. Religious and cultural exchange accompanied this trade and diplomacy. Artistic styles, religious concepts, and even certain deities showing clear evidence of cross-cultural influence and adaptation as different Bronze Age civilizations maintained sustained, meaningful contact across these centuries. This international system required considerable administrative sophistication to maintain. Palace bureaucracies managing complex records tracking trade, tribute, and diplomatic correspondence, this administrative capacity representing genuine institutional achievement across these different, cooperating Bronze Age kingdoms. Military technology and knowledge also spread throughout this interconnected system. Chariot warfare techniques, bronze weapon manufacturing, and fortification design showing considerable similarity across different regions, suggesting genuine technological and strategic knowledge exchange between these various kingdoms. This remarkably sophisticated, interconnected ancient world, precisely because of its genuine interdependence, may have also contained within that same interconnection genuine vulnerability. A possibility we'll explore as this story unfolds toward its dramatic, still genuinely mysterious collapse. Chapter 3. Egypt at the height of its power. Egypt entered this final Bronze Age period as one of the ancient world's most powerful, wealthy civilizations. The New Kingdom pharaohs, controlling not merely Egypt itself, but extending significant influence throughout the Levant and maintaining sophisticated diplomatic relationships throughout the broader region. Ramesses II, ruling for an extraordinary 66 years, had already demonstrated Egypt's continued military and diplomatic strength. His famous peace treaty with the Hittite Empire following the Battle of Kadesh, representing one of history's earliest documented formal international agreements. Egyptian temples throughout this period received extraordinary royal patronage, massive construction projects demonstrating the pharaoh's wealth and power, while providing employment for enormous numbers of skilled workers, administrators, and laborers throughout Egyptian territory. Egyptian agriculture, still reliably supported by the Nile's predictable annual flooding, continued providing the economic foundation supporting this considerable wealth and military capability. Egypt's agricultural surplus funding both massive monuments and sustained military and diplomatic activity throughout the region. Egyptian military forces maintained garrisons throughout Egyptian-controlled Levantine territory. This military presence protecting valuable trade routes while also asserting Egyptian political influence throughout this strategically crucial region, connecting Egypt with the broader Bronze Age Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. Egyptian administrative records from this period reveal sophisticated bureaucratic management, careful documentation of resources, trade, and military affairs, demonstrating genuine institutional capability that had sustained Egyptian power and stability across many previous centuries of New Kingdom rule. Despite this apparent strength, subtle signs of strain had begun appearing even before the broader Bronze Age collapse's most dramatic phase: succession disputes, occasional military setbacks, and growing administrative costs, suggesting Egyptian power, while still genuinely formidable, faced certain underlying pressures. Egyptian records from the reign of Ramesses III, ruling during the collapse's most dramatic phase, would eventually provide some of our most valuable surviving evidence about the broader crisis unfolding throughout the region. Evidence we'll examine carefully as this story continues developing. This powerful, wealthy Egyptian civilization, despite ultimately surviving the broader Bronze Age collapse more successfully than many neighboring kingdoms, would nonetheless experience genuine strain and lasting transformation as this remarkable regional crisis unfolded around them during these pivotal decades. Chapter 4: The Hittite Empire's Golden Age. The Hittite Empire, controlling much of Anatolia, present-day Turkey, represented another major Bronze Age power. This sophisticated kingdom, having successfully rivaled Egypt for regional dominance, before their eventual peace treaty established stable diplomatic relations between these two formidable powers. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, featured impressive fortifications and administrative buildings. This city, serving as the center of an empire that controlled diverse territories and peoples throughout Anatolia, requiring sophisticated administrative systems to manage this genuine diversity effectively. Hittite military technology, particularly their skilled use of chariot warfare, had established their reputation as formidable military power throughout the region. This capability allowing them to successfully compete with Egypt for control over strategically important Levantine territory during previous centuries. The Hittites maintained an extensive network of vassal states and diplomatic relationships throughout Anatolia and northern Syria. This complex political system, requiring careful diplomatic management to maintain loyalty and cooperation across these various subordinate territories and allied kingdoms. Hittite religious practice incorporated numerous deities from various conquered or allied peoples. This religious flexibility reflecting broader Hittite political pragmatism in managing their genuinely diverse imperial territory, containing numerous different ethnic and cultural groups. Trade relationships connected the Hittite Empire with neighboring civilizations extensively. Hittite territory controlling important trade routes while also depending significantly on imported resources, including the crucial tin needed for bronze production that Anatolia itself couldn't fully supply. Hittite royal archives, discovered through modern archaeological excavation, reveal sophisticated administrative and diplomatic correspondence, providing valuable historical insight into this empire's internal governance and external relationships during these final decades before the broader regional collapse began unfolding. Despite this considerable power and sophistication, the Hittite Empire would prove to be among the collapse's most complete casualties. This once formidable kingdom essentially vanishing entirely within just a few decades. A dramatic transformation we'll examine in detail as this story continues developing. This powerful Anatolian empire's eventual fate would become one of the Bronze Age collapse's most dramatic, thoroughly documented examples. Hittite civilization's near-total disappearance, representing perhaps the collapse's single most striking illustration of just how completely this crisis could transform even genuinely powerful ancient kingdoms. Chapter 5. Mycenaean Greece and the palace economies across the Aegean Sea. Mycenaean Greek civilization had developed its own sophisticated palace-centered economic and political system. Various Greek kingdoms, including Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns, each governed from impressive fortified palace centers, controlling surrounding agricultural territory. These Mycenaean palaces functioned as genuine economic centers, administrators carefully recording agricultural production, craft manufacturing, and trade activity using a writing system called Linear B. This bureaucratic sophistication, rivaling administrative systems found throughout other major Bronze Age civilizations. Mycenaean Greece maintained active trade relationships throughout the broader Mediterranean world. Greek pottery and other goods reaching distant markets, while Mycenaean kingdoms imported valuable resources, including the crucial copper and tin needed for their own bronze production and military equipment. Mycenaean military culture emphasized chariot warfare and bronze weaponry, similar to broader Bronze Age military traditions. Palace administrators carefully tracking military equipment and personnel. This administrative attention reflecting the genuine importance of military capability within Mycenaean political culture. Archaeological evidence reveals these Mycenaean palaces featured impressive architecture, including massive fortification walls at sites like Mycenae itself. These defensive structures suggesting genuine awareness of potential military threats even during this civilization's apparent height of power and prosperity. Mycenaean religious practice, reflected in later Greek mythology, incorporated numerous deities and elaborate ceremonial traditions. Palace records revealing detailed management of religious offerings and ceremonial activities integrated closely with broader palace economic and administrative functions. The relationship between different Mycenaean kingdoms remained complex, sometimes cooperative through shared trade and cultural practices, sometimes competitive or even openly hostile. This internal Greek political complexity existing alongside their broader participation in the wider Bronze Age international system. Linear B tablets, remarkably preserved through the very fires that destroyed several Mycenaean palaces, provide invaluable historical evidence about this civilization's final years. These baked clay administrative records, surviving precisely because the same destructive fires that ended palace life also accidentally preserved their written records. This sophisticated Mycenaean palace civilization would experience some of the Bronze Age collapse's most dramatic destruction, virtually every major Mycenaean palace center suffering violent destruction within a relatively brief period. This pattern representing crucial evidence for understanding the broader collapse's nature and possible causes. Chapter 6. The Kingdom of Ugarit and Mediterranean Trade. Along the Syrian coast, the Kingdom of Ugarit occupied a strategically crucial position connecting Mediterranean maritime trade with overland routes reaching into Mesopotamia. This relatively small but genuinely wealthy kingdom serving as an essential commercial hub throughout the late Bronze Age period. Ugarit's prosperity depended almost entirely on this position as a trading intermediary. Merchant ships from throughout the Mediterranean world regularly visiting Ugarit's harbor, exchanging goods that would then continue overland toward Mesopotamia and other inland destinations throughout the broader region. The city developed its own distinctive alphabetic writing system, considerably simpler than complex systems like Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian cuneiform. This innovation representing genuine intellectual achievement that would eventually influence the broader development of alphabetic writing throughout the ancient world. Ugarit maintained diplomatic and trade relationships with virtually every major Bronze Age power, royal archives revealing correspondence with Egypt, the Hittite Empire, and various other kingdoms. This extensive diplomatic network reflecting the city's genuine importance within the broader international trading system. Archaeological excavation at Ugarit has revealed remarkably detailed evidence about daily commercial life, extensive archives documenting trade transactions, diplomatic correspondence, and administrative records, providing historians with unusually rich insight into late Bronze Age commercial and political activity. The city's wealth attracted skilled craftsmen and merchants from throughout the region, Ugarit developing into a genuinely cosmopolitan urban center where different cultural and linguistic traditions intersected through the shared practical activity of extensive international commerce and trade. Ugarit's royal palace featured impressive architecture reflecting the kingdom's considerable wealth. This administrative center coordinating the complex commercial activity that sustained the broader kingdom's prosperity throughout these final decades of stable Bronze Age international trade. As we'll discover, Ugarit's final surviving correspondence, sent shortly before the city's sudden, complete destruction, provides some of history's most vivid, immediate evidence about the panic and desperation unfolding as the broader Bronze Age collapse began directly threatening this once prosperous trading kingdom. This wealthy, cosmopolitan trading center's dramatic fate would become emblematic of the broader collapse's suddenness and completeness, Ugarit essentially vanishing from history within a remarkably brief period, its extensive archives providing invaluable evidence for understanding this civilization-wide crisis. Chapter 7: Cyprus and the Copper Trade Network. The island of Cyprus held particular strategic and economic importance throughout the Bronze Age Mediterranean world. This relatively modest-sized island containing significant copper deposits that made it absolutely essential to the broader bronze production system sustaining virtually every major regional civilization. Cypriot copper mining and processing developed considerable technical sophistication, skilled metalworkers extracting and refining copper ore before shipping this crucial resource throughout the Mediterranean world, Cyprus effectively serving as the primary copper supplier for numerous major Bronze Age civilizations. This copper wealth brought Cyprus genuine prosperity and international significance disproportionate to its relatively modest physical size, the island maintaining active trade relationships with Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Ugarit, and various other major powers throughout this interconnected Bronze Age commercial system. Cypriot settlements developed considerable urban sophistication funded by this copper wealth. Archaeological evidence revealing impressive buildings, evidence of skilled craft production, and clear participation in the broader Mediterranean cultural and commercial exchange characteristic of this interconnected period. The island's strategic maritime position, situated centrally within eastern Mediterranean shipping routes, further enhanced its commercial importance. Cypriot ports serving as convenient stopping points for merchant vessels traveling between different major trading centers throughout the broader region. Cypriot craftsmen developed distinctive artistic and technical traditions, their bronze work and pottery showing both local innovation and clear evidence of broader Mediterranean cultural influence, reflecting the island's genuine integration within this interconnected Bronze Age commercial and cultural system. This economic dependence on copper export also created genuine vulnerability. Cyprus's prosperity fundamentally tied to the continued functioning of the broader international trade network that purchased their copper and provided, in return, various goods and resources the island itself couldn't produce locally. When this broader trade network began collapsing, Cyprus would face genuine economic disruption, though the island's fate during the broader Bronze Age collapse proved somewhat more complex and varied compared to the complete destruction experienced by some mainland kingdoms during this same turbulent period. Cyprus's story illustrates an important broader theme we'll continue exploring throughout this investigation: how thoroughly interconnected this Bronze Age world had become, and how this very interconnection may have contributed significantly to the collapse's remarkably widespread, cascading regional impact. Chapter 8: Babylon and Assyria in the Late Bronze Age. In Mesopotamia, both Babylon and the rising Assyrian kingdom maintained significant political and economic importance throughout this Late Bronze Age period. These Mesopotamian powers, participating actively within the broader international diplomatic and commercial system alongside Egypt, the Hittites, and other major kingdoms. Babylon, though no longer possessing the singular dominance it had achieved centuries earlier under Hammurabi, remained a significant regional power, Babylonian kings maintaining diplomatic relationships throughout the broader Bronze Age world while overseeing considerable agricultural and commercial wealth. Assyria, meanwhile, was gradually building toward the greater regional power it would eventually achieve in subsequent centuries. This kingdom's military and administrative capabilities steadily developing throughout the Late Bronze Age period, laying foundations for its later, more extensive imperial expansion. Mesopotamian scholarly and administrative traditions, including sophisticated mathematical, astronomical, and legal knowledge developed across previous centuries, continued flourishing throughout this period. Babylonian scribes maintaining detailed records and continuing important intellectual traditions established by earlier Mesopotamian civilizations. Trade connected Mesopotamia with the broader Mediterranean world, both through overland routes and via intermediary trading centers like Ugarit, Mesopotamian goods and resources flowing toward Mediterranean markets, while various imported materials, including certain metals and luxury goods, flowed in return. Diplomatic correspondence between Mesopotamian rulers and other major Bronze Age powers reveals continued active participation within the broader international diplomatic system, Babylonian and Assyrian rulers exchanging messages, gifts, and formal diplomatic protocol with Egyptian pharaohs and other regional powers. Mesopotamia's geographic position, somewhat removed from the Mediterranean coast, where much of the collapse's most dramatic destruction would eventually occur, meant these Mesopotamian powers would experience the broader Bronze Age collapse somewhat differently compared to more directly affected coastal and Mediterranean-adjacent kingdoms. This relative geographic separation wouldn't mean complete immunity from the broader crisis. However, disrupted international trade networks and broader regional instability inevitably affecting Mesopotamian kingdoms as well, even if their experience differed considerably from the complete destruction experienced elsewhere. Understanding Mesopotamia's somewhat different collapse experience provides valuable comparative perspective, helping historians distinguish between factors affecting the entire interconnected Bronze Age system versus more geographically specific causes, particularly devastating certain coastal and Mediterranean-adjacent civilizations during this turbulent period. Chapter 9. The first warning signs before the Bronze Age collapse's most dramatic, widely destructive phase. Historians and archaeologists have identified subtle but genuinely significant warning signs suggesting this interconnected system had already begun experiencing meaningful strain during the decades immediately preceding the crisis's full onset. Egyptian records from the reign of Meneptah, around 1207 BCE, mention military conflict with various groups, including some later associated with the mysterious Sea Peoples. This relatively early reference suggesting these disruptive forces had already begun affecting the region before the collapse's most severe phase. Climate evidence, including pollen analysis and other paleoclimatic indicators, suggests the eastern Mediterranean region experienced a significant, sustained drought, beginning sometime in the decades before 1200 BCE. This environmental stress potentially straining agricultural systems already supporting substantial urban populations. Diplomatic correspondence from this period increasingly mentions grain shortages and requests for emergency food assistance between kingdoms. This pattern suggesting agricultural production throughout the region may have already begun experiencing genuine difficulty even before the collapse's most dramatic destructive phase. Some archaeological sites show evidence of increased fortification construction during these final pre-collapse decades. This defensive building activity suggesting growing awareness of potential security threats, even while the broader international system continued functioning in its familiar, established patterns. Trade patterns show subtle shifts during this period as well. Some historians identifying changes in shipping routes and commercial activity that might suggest growing disruption to the established trading networks that had sustained this interconnected Bronze Age economic system for so many previous generations. Internal political tensions also appear within some kingdoms during these final pre-collapse decades. Succession disputes and occasional internal conflict suggesting genuine political strain even within seemingly stable, powerful kingdoms like Egypt and the Hittite Empire during this crucial transitional period. These various warning signs, while individually perhaps not seeming immediately catastrophic, collectively suggest a Bronze Age world already experiencing meaningful stress and vulnerability before the crisis's most dramatic, widely destructive phase began unfolding across the broader Eastern Mediterranean and Near Eastern region. Understanding these earlier warning signs helps historians move beyond viewing the Bronze Age collapse as a single, sudden catastrophic event, instead recognizing it as the culmination of gradually accumulating pressures that eventually combined to produce this remarkably rapid, widespread civilizational crisis. Chapter 10. Who were the Sea Peoples? Among the Bronze Age collapse's most mysterious elements, Egyptian records describe a confederation of sea-borne raiders and migrants historians now call the Sea Peoples. This loosely organized group appearing repeatedly in surviving accounts as a significant disruptive force during the collapse's most active period. Egyptian inscriptions, particularly detailed records from Ramesses III's reign, list numerous specific group names among these sea peoples, including the Peliset, Shurdan, Shekelesh, and several others, though connecting these ancient names to specific, clearly identified origins remains genuinely challenging for modern historians. Some scholars have proposed connections between certain Sea Peoples groups and specific regions, the Peliset possibly connected to the later Philistines who would settle in the Levant, while other groups show possible connections to Sardinia, Sicily, or various Aegean and Anatolian regions, though these identifications remain genuinely uncertain. The Sea Peoples don't appear to have represented a single unified nation or ethnic group, but rather likely constituted a loose confederation of different peoples, possibly including displaced populations, opportunistic raiders, and genuine migrants, all moving through the eastern Mediterranean during this turbulent period. Egyptian depictions show these groups using distinctive weapons, armor, and characteristic ships, this visual evidence providing valuable, if still somewhat ambiguous, clues about their possible origins and cultural background, artistic conventions, sometimes making precise identification genuinely difficult for modern scholars. Some historians increasingly suggest the Sea Peoples might represent more a symptom than a root cause of the broader collapse. Displaced populations fleeing their own collapsing societies or environmental pressures, rather than an external invading force, independently causing widespread destruction throughout the region. This reinterpretation suggests a more complex picture than simple invasion narratives, various groups potentially becoming Sea Peoples raiders precisely because their own home regions had already experienced serious disruption, creating a cascading pattern of displacement and further disruption throughout the broader region. Archaeological evidence for Sea Peoples' actual military capability and organization remains somewhat limited beyond Egyptian textual and artistic sources, leaving considerable scholarly uncertainty about exactly how significant a role these groups actually played in causing versus simply participating in the broader regional collapse. Understanding the Sea Peoples requires acknowledging genuine historical uncertainty. This mysterious group representing one of the Bronze Age collapse's most fascinating unresolved puzzles. Their true nature and precise role continuing to generate active scholarly debate and ongoing archaeological investigation even today. Chapter 11. The Sea Peoples' first recorded attacks. The earliest clearly documented Sea Peoples activity appears in Egyptian records from Merneptah's reign, around 1207 BCE, describing a coalition including Libyan forces alongside various Sea Peoples groups attempting to invade Egyptian territory from the western frontier region. Merneptah's forces successfully repelled this invasion attempt, Egyptian inscriptions claiming substantial casualties inflicted upon the invading coalition. This military success suggesting Egypt still maintained considerable defensive capability during this relatively early phase of the broader regional crisis. This early conflict provides valuable evidence that Sea Peoples activity, or at least activity by groups later associated with this broader phenomenon, had already begun disrupting the region before the collapse's most severe, widely destructive phase occurred approximately 2 decades later during Ramesses III's reign. The specific groups mentioned in Merneptah's records don't perfectly match those appearing later in Ramesses III's more extensive documentation. This variation, suggesting the Sea Peoples phenomenon, may have evolved and expanded considerably during the intervening decades between these two documented conflicts. Some historians interpret this pattern as evidence of gradually escalating disruption, initial, relatively contained incidents eventually expanding into the much broader, more devastating pattern of destruction that would eventually affect numerous major Bronze Age civilizations throughout the region. Archaeological evidence from various coastal sites throughout the eastern Mediterranean shows destruction layers that some researchers date to this earlier period, suggesting the broader pattern of coastal raiding and destruction may have begun gradually rather than occurring as a single, sudden, coordinated attack. The relationship between these early Sea Peoples' activities and other contemporary pressures, including the drought conditions and agricultural stress previously discussed, remains genuinely debated. Some historians suggesting environmental pressure may have directly motivated some early Sea Peoples' raiding and migration activity. This earlier conflict during Merneptah's reign represents a crucial piece of evidence for understanding the collapse's actual chronology, demonstrating that whatever combination of factors ultimately produced the full crisis had already begun manifesting in some form considerably before the collapse's most severe, widely destructive final phase. Recognizing this earlier warning provides important context for everything that would follow during the subsequent 2 decades. The Eastern Mediterranean world experiencing gradually escalating disruption rather than a single, entirely unexpected sudden catastrophe striking a previously stable, untroubled region. Chapter 12. The Fall of the Hittite Empire. The Hittite Empire's collapse represents one of the Bronze Age crisis's most dramatic and complete examples. This once powerful kingdom that had successfully rivaled Egypt for regional dominance, essentially disappearing from history within a remarkably brief period during the early 12th century BCE. Archaeological evidence from Hattusa, the Hittite capital, reveals the city was largely abandoned and partially destroyed sometime around 1200 BCE, though interestingly, evidence suggests this abandonment may have been somewhat more gradual and less violently sudden than sometimes popularly portrayed. Some archaeological evidence suggests Hittite administrators may have deliberately relocated the royal archives and other valuable resources before the capital's final abandonment. This pattern suggesting genuine awareness of an approaching crisis rather than complete, unexpected surprise, catching Hittite leadership entirely unprepared. The exact causes of Hittite collapse likely involved multiple interacting factors, including disrupted grain supplies from Egypt and other regions, internal political instability, and possible military pressure from various directions. This combination of pressures proving ultimately overwhelming for even this formidable ancient empire. Hittite vassal states throughout Anatolia and northern Syria experienced their own disruption during this period. The broader imperial administrative system that had maintained Hittite control gradually breaking down as central authority weakened and various regional territories increasingly acted independently. Some Hittite successor states did emerge in southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria following the empire's collapse. These smaller Neo-Hittite kingdoms preserving certain Hittite cultural and political traditions, though nothing approaching the original empire's former scale, power, or genuine international significance. The complete disappearance of Hittite imperial administration meant the loss of considerable accumulated knowledge and administrative capability. This institutional collapse, representing genuine civilizational loss beyond simply political reorganization, valuable knowledge and expertise disappearing alongside the collapsed imperial structure itself. Modern archaeological investigation continues revealing additional detail about the Hittite Empire's final years. Ongoing excavation at Hattusa and other Hittite sites providing increasingly nuanced understanding of exactly how this dramatic, historically significant collapse actually unfolded during these crucial final decades. The Hittite Empire's dramatic fall serves as perhaps the clearest, most thoroughly documented example of just how completely the Bronze Age collapse could transform even a genuinely powerful, sophisticated ancient civilization within a remarkably brief historical time frame. Chapter 13. Ugarit's Final. Desperate letters among the Bronze Age collapse's most historically valuable evidence. Clay tablets discovered at Ugarit, some apparently baked hard by the very fires that destroyed the city, preserve remarkably vivid, immediate correspondence from this kingdom's final, desperate days before complete destruction. One particularly striking letter, apparently never sent, describes enemy ships approaching Ugarit's coast while the kingdom's own military forces remained absent, having been sent elsewhere to assist Hittite forces. This letter capturing genuine, immediate panic as the crisis directly threatened the city itself. Other correspondence from this final period reveals Ugarit's king desperately requesting military assistance from neighboring powers. These urgent appeals suggesting genuine awareness that the kingdom faced serious, immediate danger, though effective assistance apparently never arrived in time to prevent the city's ultimate destruction. Archaeological evidence confirms Ugarit was indeed destroyed by fire around 1190 to 1185 BCE. This destruction layer, containing evidence suggesting sudden, violent conflict rather than gradual abandonment, the city's final moments apparently involving genuine military attack rather than simple economic decline. The presence of arrowheads and other weapons among the destruction debris provides physical evidence supporting textual accounts suggesting violent conflict. Archaeologists finding evidence consistent with the kind of sudden, devastating attack that Ugarit's final desperate letters seem to anticipate and fear. Interestingly, Ugarit was never significantly resettled after this destruction, unlike some other Bronze Age sites that eventually saw renewed habitation. This complete abandonment suggesting the destruction was severe enough or the broader regional circumstances disrupted enough to prevent any meaningful recovery. The specific identity of Ugarit's attackers remains genuinely uncertain. Some evidence suggesting possible Sea People's involvement, though the correspondence itself doesn't definitively identify exactly who threatened the city, leaving this crucial historical question still subject to ongoing scholarly interpretation and debate. These remarkably preserved final communications provide historians with an unusually direct, emotionally immediate window into the Bronze Age collapse's human experience, moving beyond abstract historical analysis to capture genuine individual fear and desperation during this civilization's final, catastrophic days. Ugarit's dramatic, well-documented fall represents one of the collapse's most historically valuable case studies. This kingdom's sudden destruction and remarkably preserved final correspondence, offering crucial evidence for understanding both the collapse's mechanics and its genuine human cost. Chapter 14. The Destruction of Mycenaean Palaces Across the Aegean. Mycenaean Greek palace centers experienced their own dramatic destruction during this same general period. Archaeological excavation revealing violent destruction layers at virtually every major Mycenaean palace site. This pattern, representing one of the collapse's most geographically widespread examples. Pylos, one of the best archaeologically documented Mycenaean sites, shows clear evidence of sudden, violent destruction by fire. The very fires that destroyed this palace also accidentally preserving numerous Linear B clay tablets that would otherwise have simply decomposed over subsequent centuries. These preserved Pylos tablets reveal fascinating detail about the palace's final period, including records suggesting military preparations and coastal defense arrangements. This evidence indicating Pylos administrators were apparently aware of some approaching threat before the palace's ultimate destruction occurred. Mycenae itself, despite its famous massive fortification walls, also experienced significant destruction during this period, though the exact timing and circumstances remain somewhat debated among archaeologists studying this particularly complex, multi-layered archaeological site. Tiryns and other Mycenaean centers show similar patterns of violent destruction. This widespread pattern across multiple independently governed Mycenaean kingdoms, suggesting either a shared external threat affecting the entire region or possibly internal conflicts and rebellions occurring somewhat independently across different Greek kingdoms. The loss of Linear B writing following this palace destruction represents a particularly significant consequence. This administrative writing system, apparently tied specifically to palace bureaucratic functions, meaning its collapse, alongside the palaces themselves, left Greece without functional writing for several subsequent centuries. Some archaeological evidence suggests certain Mycenaean populations survived and relocated following their palace's destruction. Smaller settlements, sometimes showing continued habitation, even as the grand palace centers themselves were permanently abandoned, suggesting population survival even amid this dramatic institutional collapse. The specific causes of Mycenaean palace destruction remain genuinely debated, theories ranging from Sea People's attacks, internal Greek conflict between rival kingdoms, social uprising against palace authority, or some combination of these and other factors, including the broader environmental and economic pressures affecting the wider region. This widespread Mycenaean destruction would usher in what historians call the Greek Dark Age. Several centuries of reduced population, lost literacy, and significantly diminished material culture compared to the sophisticated palace civilization that had existed just before this dramatic, still genuinely mysterious collapse occurred. Chapter 15. Egypt's Struggle for Survival. Egypt, while ultimately surviving the broader Bronze Age collapse more successfully than many neighboring kingdoms, nonetheless faced genuine, serious challenges during this turbulent period, particularly during the reign of Ramesses III, who confronted major Sea People's invasion attempts. Egyptian inscriptions from Ramesses III's reign, Particularly detailed records at his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu describe major military campaigns against Sea People's forces attempting to invade Egyptian territory both by land and by sea around 1175 BCE. These detailed Egyptian records, including remarkable relief carvings depicting naval battle scenes, provide some of our most vivid surviving evidence about Sea People's military capability and appearance, though these Egyptian sources naturally present events from Egypt's own celebratory, victory-focused perspective. Egyptian forces apparently successfully repelled these major invasion attempts. Ramesses III's inscriptions claiming decisive victory. This military success representing a crucial factor in Egypt's relative survival compared to the complete collapse experienced by kingdoms like the Hittite Empire during this same period. Despite these military successes, Egypt experienced significant internal strain during and after this crisis period. Economic difficulties, including evidence of the world's first recorded labor strike among royal tomb workers, frustrated by delayed grain payments, suggesting genuine economic pressure even amid military victory. Egyptian control over Levantine territory weakened considerably following this crisis period. Egypt gradually withdrawing from direct administrative control over regions it had previously dominated. This retreat suggesting genuine strain on Egyptian resources and administrative capacity even as the kingdom itself avoided complete collapse. Ramesses III's reign, despite these military successes, would prove to be Egypt's last truly powerful new kingdom pharaoh. Subsequent rulers presiding over a period of gradually declining central authority and increasing internal political fragmentation throughout the following decades and centuries. Egypt's experience demonstrates an important nuance within the broader Bronze Age collapse narrative. Some kingdoms managing partial survival through military resilience and geographic advantages, even while experiencing genuine internal strain and long-term diminished power compared to their previous Bronze Age peak. This Egyptian case illustrates how the Bronze Age collapse didn't necessarily mean complete destruction for every affected civilization, but rather produced varying degrees of disruption, decline, and transformation depending on each kingdom's particular circumstances, resources, and response to this widespread regional crisis. Chapter 16: Climate Change and the Bronze Age Drought. Among the various theories explaining the Bronze Age collapse, climate change and associated drought conditions have received increasing scholarly attention in recent decades. Paleoclimatic evidence suggesting the Eastern Mediterranean experienced significant environmental stress during this crucial historical period. Scientific analysis of ancient pollen samples preserved in lake and sea sediment cores reveals changing vegetation patterns consistent with reduced rainfall throughout the Eastern Mediterranean region during the years surrounding the Bronze Age collapse. This evidence suggesting genuine, significant climatic disruption. Some researchers have specifically identified evidence for what they call a mega drought, an unusually severe and prolonged dry period potentially lasting several decades. This extended environmental stress possibly overwhelming agricultural systems that had developed during previous, more climatically favorable centuries. This drought hypothesis helps explain several otherwise puzzling aspects of the broader collapse, including widespread evidence of famine and grain shortages appearing in diplomatic correspondence, alongside the broader pattern of population displacement and migration associated with sea peoples' activity throughout the region. Reduced agricultural production due to drought could plausibly explain rising social tension and political instability throughout affected kingdoms, food scarcity historically representing a significant trigger for internal rebellion, migration, and desperate raiding behavior throughout numerous other historical periods and civilizations. Critics of climate-focused explanations note that drought alone likely cannot fully explain every aspect of the collapse, particularly the specific pattern of violent destruction at numerous palace sites, suggesting environmental stress likely combined with other factors rather than representing a single complete explanation. Some historians propose that drought conditions may have specifically triggered the population movements associated with sea peoples' activity, groups from drought-affected regions potentially migrating toward more agriculturally productive areas. This movement then triggering cascading conflict and disruption throughout the broader interconnected region. Ongoing scientific research continues refining our understanding of this period's actual climatic conditions. Improved paleoclimatic reconstruction techniques providing increasingly detailed, though still genuinely debated, evidence about exactly how significant environmental factors actually were within the broader collapse's complex causation. This climate change perspective represents an important contribution to modern understanding of the Bronze Age collapse, suggesting environmental factors likely played meaningful roles alongside political, military, and economic pressures in producing this remarkably widespread, historically significant, ancient civilizational crisis. Chapter 17: Earthquakes across the Eastern Mediterranean. Beyond drought and warfare, archaeological evidence increasingly points toward another significant contributing factor in the Bronze Age collapse: a remarkable cluster of destructive earthquakes affecting numerous sites throughout the Eastern Mediterranean during roughly this same historical period. Archaeologists studying destruction layers at various Bronze Age sites have identified physical evidence consistent with earthquake damage, including collapsed walls showing patterns of structural failure, skeletal remains found in positions suggesting sudden building collapse, and other physical indicators distinct from typical fire or warfare destruction. This pattern, sometimes called an earthquake storm by researchers, describes how a major seismic event along one fault line can trigger subsequent earthquakes along connected fault systems over subsequent years or decades, potentially explaining destruction occurring across multiple sites over an extended period rather than a single moment. The Eastern Mediterranean sits along genuinely active tectonic boundaries, this region historically experiencing significant seismic activity, making the possibility of a particularly severe earthquake sequence during the Bronze Age collapse period entirely plausible given the region's known geological characteristics. Some archaeologists have specifically identified earthquake damage at sites including Mycenae, Tiryns, and various other locations previously attributed solely to warfare or deliberate destruction. This reassessment suggesting natural disaster may have played a more significant role than earlier interpretations initially assumed. Earthquake damage could also help explain some of the broader crisis's cascading effects. Damaged fortifications, potentially leaving previously secure cities more vulnerable to subsequent human attack, while destroyed infrastructure and agricultural facilities could worsen existing food security problems throughout affected regions. Critics note that distinguishing earthquake damage from deliberate destruction isn't always straightforward archaeologically, and that earthquake evidence, even where genuinely present, doesn't necessarily explain every aspect of the broader collapse, particularly evidence for organized military conflict and sea peoples' activity. Most contemporary historians studying this period now favor combined explanations acknowledging multiple simultaneous pressures: earthquake damage potentially weakening already stressed societies facing drought, economic disruption, and military threats, rather than representing a single, complete explanation for the entire collapse. This earthquake evidence adds genuinely important nuance to our understanding of the Bronze Age collapse, suggesting this ancient world faced not merely human political and military pressures, but also significant natural disaster risk that likely compounded and worsened other simultaneous sources of genuine historical crisis and disruption. Chapter 18: The Collapse of International Trade Networks. Whatever combination of specific triggers ultimately initiated the Bronze Age collapse, historians broadly agree that the breakdown of this era's sophisticated international trade networks represented both a significant consequence and, likely, a factor that further accelerated and deepened the broader regional crisis. The bronze production system itself depended entirely on reliable, long-distance trade connecting copper sources like Cyprus with tin sources located considerably further away. This fundamental technological dependence, meaning any significant disruption to shipping and trade routes, directly threatened essential military and agricultural technology. As coastal raiding, palace destruction, and general regional instability increased throughout this crisis period, merchant ships faced growing danger. Insurance costs, practically speaking, would have risen dramatically, while established trading relationships between different kingdoms became increasingly difficult to reliably maintain. This trade disruption created genuinely severe cascading consequences. Kingdoms unable to reliably import tin faced serious difficulty maintaining bronze weapon and tool production. This technological vulnerability potentially weakening military capability precisely when strong defense had become most critically important. Grain shipments, crucial for regions experiencing drought-related agricultural shortfalls, similarly became increasingly unreliable as trade networks broke down. This disruption potentially worsening the very food security crisis that may have originally contributed to increased raiding, migration, and internal social unrest. Specialized craftsmen and skilled workers who had previously traveled between kingdoms as part of this interconnected system found their traditional patterns of employment and knowledge exchange increasingly disrupted. This loss of skilled mobility potentially accelerating broader technological and administrative decline. The palace-centered economic systems, characteristic of Mycenaean Greece and other Bronze Age kingdoms, proved particularly vulnerable to this trade disruption. These economies, having developed considerable specialization and interdependence that assumed continued access to reliable long-distance trade relationships. Some regions and settlements less dependent on this long-distance trade network, particularly smaller, more agriculturally self-sufficient communities, appear to have weathered the broader collapse somewhat more successfully than the grand palace centers, whose prosperity had depended so heavily on this now disrupted international commercial system. This trade network collapse illustrates a crucial broader lesson about the Bronze Age crisis. The very sophistication and interconnection that had made this era's civilizations so prosperous and impressive also created genuine systemic vulnerability. Once that delicate, complex web of relationships began seriously unraveling. Chapter 19. Internal Rebellion and Social Collapse. Beyond external threats like sea peoples raiding and environmental pressures like drought, some historians emphasize evidence suggesting internal social and political unrest may have played significant roles in the Bronze Age collapse. Ordinary populations potentially rebelling against strained, increasingly ineffective palace authorities. The palace-centered economic systems, characteristic of civilizations like Mycenaean Greece, required considerable ordinary population cooperation and labor. Palace administrators managing agricultural production, craft manufacturing, and resource distribution through elaborate bureaucratic systems requiring genuine popular compliance and support. As external pressures including drought, disrupted trade, and military threats increasingly strained these palace systems, ordinary populations may have experienced growing hardship and dissatisfaction. This pressure potentially eventually manifesting as internal rebellion or simply widespread refusal to continue supporting increasingly ineffective palace authority. Some archaeological evidence from certain sites suggests destruction patterns more consistent with internal uprising than external attack. Specific palace buildings targeted while surrounding settlements remained relatively undisturbed. This pattern potentially indicating deliberate rebellion against specific ruling authorities rather than indiscriminate external raiding. Egyptian records mentioning labor unrest, including the previously discussed tomb worker strike during Ramesses III's reign, provide direct evidence that internal social tension existed even within Egypt, one of the more successfully surviving Bronze Age powers during this broader regional crisis. The loss of centralized palace authority following initial destruction or disruption may have created additional cascading internal instability. Local elites and former palace administrators potentially competing for reduced remaining resources and authority. This internal competition further undermining any possibility of organized recovery. Some historians specifically theorize that the very complexity and rigid hierarchical structure of Bronze Age palace economies made them particularly vulnerable to this kind of internal collapse, once initial external pressures began creating genuine strain. Simpler, less centralized societies potentially proving more adaptable and resilient. This internal rebellion theory doesn't necessarily contradict other explanations involving climate, trade disruption, or sea peoples activity, but rather suggests these various pressures likely interacted, external stress creating internal social tension that then further accelerated and deepened the broader systemic collapse already underway. Understanding this internal dimension adds important human complexity to the Bronze Age collapse narrative, reminding us that this crisis likely involved not merely external threats and environmental pressure, but also genuine internal political and social transformation as ordinary populations responded to their rapidly changing, increasingly difficult circumstances. Chapter 20. The Systems Collapse Theory. Given the numerous interacting factors we've explored, including climate stress, trade disruption, sea peoples activity, earthquakes, and internal rebellion, many contemporary historians now favor what's sometimes called systems collapse theory as the most compelling overall explanation for the Bronze Age crisis. This theoretical framework suggests that rather than any single decisive cause, the Bronze Age collapse resulted from multiple simultaneous stresses interacting and compounding one another within an already highly interconnected, interdependent system, creating cascading failures that individual pressures alone likely couldn't have produced. The very interconnection that had made Bronze Age civilizations so sophisticated and prosperous, extensive trade networks, specialized palace economies, and complex diplomatic relationships also created genuine systemic fragility, disruption in one area potentially cascading rapidly throughout the broader interconnected system. Systems theory, drawn partly from modern ecological and economic research studying how complex systems respond to stress, suggests that highly optimized, efficient systems often become simultaneously more vulnerable to complete collapse once they exceed certain resilience thresholds, compared to simpler, less efficient, but more adaptable systems. Applied to the Bronze Age context, this framework suggests that drought-related agricultural stress, disrupted trade networks, increased raiding and migration, internal social unrest, and possibly earthquake damage all interacted simultaneously, each pressure worsening the others in ways that overwhelmed any individual kingdom's capacity for effective response. This explanation helps account for the collapse's remarkable geographic breadth and near-simultaneous timing across numerous different, independently governed kingdoms. A systems-level explanation better matching this widespread pattern compared to theories emphasizing any single specific cause affecting one particular region or civilization. Critics of systems collapse theory sometimes note it can feel somewhat unsatisfying precisely because it doesn't identify one clear, primary cause, though proponents argue this genuine complexity actually better reflects historical reality, compared to oversimplified single-cause explanations that struggle to account for the crisis's full scope and complexity. This systems-based understanding also offers valuable broader historical perspective beyond the Bronze Age specifically, helping historians studying other historical collapses recognize similar patterns where interconnected complexity, while bringing genuine prosperity, can simultaneously create vulnerability to cascading, multi-factor systemic crisis. Most contemporary Bronze Age scholars now generally accept some version of this multi-causal systems framework, viewing the collapse not as a simple story with one clear villain or cause, but rather as a genuinely complex historical event resulting from multiple interacting pressures overwhelming an increasingly fragile, highly interconnected ancient world. Chapter 21. What archaeology reveals about the destruction layers. Modern archaeological methods have provided increasingly detailed, sophisticated evidence about exactly how the Bronze Age collapse's destruction actually unfolded at specific sites. This careful physical evidence helping historians move beyond purely textual sources toward more precise, scientifically grounded understanding. Stratigraphic analysis. Carefully examining the layered sequence of archaeological deposits at excavated sites allows researchers to establish relatively precise chronological sequences, determining exactly when specific destruction events occurred relative to other archaeological evidence at each particular location. Radiocarbon dating and other scientific dating techniques have increasingly refined the collapse's overall chronology, helping researchers determine whether destruction at different sites occurred simultaneously, suggesting a shared cause, or across an extended period, potentially suggesting more gradual, cascading disruption. Careful analysis of destruction debris itself provides valuable clues about specific causes, distinguishing between fire damage, earthquake-related structural collapse, and evidence of deliberate human destruction through examination of debris patterns, burn marks, and the specific ways buildings actually failed and collapsed. Weapon finds, including arrowheads and other military equipment discovered within destruction layers, provide direct evidence for violent conflict at specific sites. Though the absence of such evidence at other locations suggests not every destruction event necessarily involved direct military confrontation. Skeletal remains, where preserved, offer particularly valuable evidence, forensic analysis sometimes revealing whether individuals died from violence, building collapse, or other causes. This direct physical evidence providing crucial insight beyond what textual sources alone could definitively establish. Some sites show evidence of apparent looting following initial destruction, valuable items missing from otherwise intact destruction layers. This pattern, suggesting organized raiding rather than purely incidental destruction, while other sites show valuable items left undisturbed, suggesting different circumstances entirely. Comparative analysis across multiple sites throughout the broader region has revealed genuinely significant variation, some locations showing clear evidence of violent conflict, others suggesting gradual abandonment, and still others showing evidence more consistent with natural disaster. This diversity supporting the multi-causal systems collapse framework previously discussed. This careful archaeological methodology, combining stratigraphic analysis, scientific dating, and detailed physical evidence examination, continues providing historians with increasingly nuanced, evidence-based understanding of this genuinely complex ancient crisis, moving well beyond earlier, more simplistic historical interpretations. Chapter 22. Life in the immediate aftermath. Following the Bronze Age collapse's most destructive phase, surviving populations throughout the affected regions faced genuinely difficult circumstances. Archaeological evidence revealing significantly reduced population levels, simplified material culture, and considerably diminished long-distance trade compared to the previous prosperous era. Former palace centers throughout Mycenaean Greece and elsewhere generally weren't rebuilt to their previous grandeur, surviving populations instead establishing smaller, simpler settlements. This pattern suggesting the sophisticated administrative and economic systems that had supported palace civilization had genuinely, permanently broken down. Craft production noticeably declined in sophistication throughout many affected regions. Pottery and metalwork from this immediate post-collapse period generally showing simpler techniques and designs compared to the skilled, elaborate craftsmanship characteristic of the previous Bronze Age peak, suggesting genuine loss of specialized knowledge and resources. Population levels appear to have declined significantly in many affected regions. Archaeological survey evidence suggesting numerous settlements were either abandoned entirely or experienced substantial population reduction, though the exact causes, whether direct violence, disease, famine, or migration, likely varied considerably by specific location. Trade networks that had previously connected this interconnected Bronze Age world largely collapsed. Archaeological evidence showing sharply reduced presence of imported goods and materials throughout the post-collapse period. Communities increasingly relying on local resources rather than the extensive exchange networks previously available. Some regions and populations fared considerably better than others during this difficult transitional period, certain areas maintaining greater continuity and stability, while others experienced more severe disruption. This regional variation reflecting the complex, multi-causal nature of the broader collapse previously discussed. Surviving communities developed new adaptive strategies suited to this changed environment. Agricultural practices sometimes shifting toward greater self-sufficiency, while political organization generally became considerably more localized and fragmented compared to the larger, more centralized kingdoms of the previous Bronze Age period. Iron technology, interestingly, began spreading more widely during this general period. Some historians suggesting disrupted bronze trade networks may have encouraged increased experimentation with iron, a metal requiring different, ultimately more widely available raw materials compared to bronze's dependence on traded tin. This challenging immediate aftermath period, while genuinely difficult for surviving populations, would eventually give way to gradual recovery and transformation, laying groundwork, however slowly and unevenly, for the different civilizational patterns that would eventually characterize the subsequent Iron Age throughout this broader region. Chapter 23. The Greek Dark Age begins. In Greece specifically, the Bronze Age collapse's aftermath ushered in a period historians traditionally call the Greek Dark Age, stretching roughly from 1100 to 800 BCE. This extended period characterized by significantly reduced population, lost literacy, and dramatically simplified material culture. Following Mycenaean palace destruction, Greek society fragmented into considerably smaller, more localized communities. The sophisticated centralized administration that had characterized palace civilization giving way to simpler village-level social organization throughout much of the Greek mainland and surrounding islands. Linear B writing, tied specifically to palace bureaucratic functions, disappeared entirely following palace destruction. Greece experiencing several centuries without any functional writing system, this dramatic loss of literacy representing one of the collapse's most striking, well-documented cultural consequences. Archaeological evidence reveals significantly reduced population throughout Greece during this period. Settlement surveys showing many previously inhabited sites abandoned entirely, while surviving communities generally show evidence of simpler, more modest material circumstances compared to the previous Mycenaean palace era. Trade with the broader Mediterranean world diminished considerably during this period. Greek communities increasingly isolated from the international exchange networks that had previously connected Mycenaean civilization with Egypt, the Near East, and other Bronze Age centers throughout the broader region. Despite these genuine hardships, Greek communities during this Dark Age period weren't entirely without cultural development. Archaeological evidence suggesting gradual population recovery, developing new artistic traditions, and maintaining certain cultural continuities, including oral traditions that would eventually contribute to later Greek epic poetry. The Homeric epics, the Iliad and Odyssey, though composed and written down considerably later, likely preserve some genuine memories and oral traditions stretching back toward this Dark Age period and even earlier Mycenaean civilization. These epic poems, representing crucial cultural bridges connecting Greece's Bronze Age past with its later classical development. Gradually, beginning around 800 BCE, Greek civilization began experiencing renewed development, population growth, expanding trade connections, and eventually, the adoption of a new alphabetic writing system borrowed and adapted from Phoenician traders. This recovery eventually launching Greece's remarkable subsequent classical civilization. This Greek Dark Age illustrates the Bronze Age collapse's genuinely long-lasting consequences, several centuries passing before Greek civilization recovered population levels, material sophistication, and cultural achievement comparable to what had existed before this dramatic, historically significant regional crisis occurred. Chapter 24: The Loss of Writing Itself Among the Bronze Age Collapse's Most Striking Cultural Consequences. Several affected regions experienced complete or near-complete loss of literacy. Sophisticated writing systems that had taken centuries to develop essentially disappearing alongside the palace institutions and specialized scribal training that had originally sustained them. Linear B, the Mycenaean Greek administrative writing system, disappeared entirely following palace destruction. This writing system apparently tied so specifically to palace bureaucratic functions that its collapse alongside these institutions left Greece without any functional writing for several subsequent centuries. Hittite cuneiform writing similarly disappeared following the Hittite Empire's collapse, though this writing tradition would continue in modified forms among certain successor states, and, more broadly, cuneiform writing itself continued in Mesopotamia, where political continuity remained somewhat greater than in Anatolia or Greece. This pattern reveals something important about how writing systems in this ancient period typically functioned. Literacy generally remaining limited to specially trained scribal professionals serving specific administrative or religious institutions, rather than representing widespread general population literacy that might have proven more resilient to institutional collapse. When palace administrations collapsed, the specific institutional support, funding, and specialized training programs that had sustained scribal education similarly disappeared. This institutional dependency, meaning writing itself, could genuinely vanish alongside collapsing political structures rather than persisting independently. The practical consequences of this literacy loss proved significant. Affected societies losing not merely the ability to create new written records, but also, gradually, the ability to read and understand previously created texts, valuable accumulated knowledge, and historical memory potentially becoming genuinely inaccessible. Not every Bronze Age writing system disappeared entirely. However, Egyptian hieroglyphic writing continued throughout this period, reflecting Egypt's relatively greater political continuity, while Mesopotamian cuneiform similarly persisted, these surviving writing traditions providing crucial continued documentation throughout the broader regional crisis. The eventual redevelopment of writing in previously affected regions, including Greece's adoption of Phoenician-derived alphabetic writing centuries later, represents a genuinely significant cultural achievement. Societies essentially having to reconstruct fundamental literacy capability that earlier generations had already once achieved before this collapse. This dramatic loss and eventual recovery of writing illustrates the Bronze Age collapse's profound cultural impact, demonstrating how thoroughly this crisis could disrupt even fundamental cultural achievements that modern observers might otherwise assume represented permanent, irreversible human civilizational progress. Chapter 25: Survivors and Migration Patterns. Throughout the Bronze Age collapse's turbulent decades, various populations experienced significant displacement and migration, communities fleeing disrupted homelands in search of greater stability. This widespread population movement representing another crucial dimension of the broader regional crisis and its lasting consequences. The Philistines, appearing in later biblical and archaeological records settling along the Levantine coast, may represent one such migrant population. Some historians connecting them to the Peliset group mentioned in Egyptian Sea Peoples records. Though this connection, while plausible, remains genuinely debated among scholars. Various Aegean populations appear to have migrated eastward during this period. Archaeological evidence suggesting cultural connections between certain Cypriot and Levantine sites showing Aegean-influenced pottery and material culture appearing in the post-collapse period, potentially reflecting genuine population movement rather than simple trade influence. Some Anatolian populations, following the Hittite Empire's collapse, apparently migrated or reorganized into smaller successor territories. This pattern reflecting how political collapse could trigger significant population reorganization even without necessarily involving the longer distance migration associated with Sea Peoples activity. Mesopotamian regions, experiencing somewhat different, generally less severe disruption compared to more directly affected Mediterranean coastal areas, may have received some migrant populations fleeing more severely affected western regions, though clear archaeological evidence for this specific pattern remains somewhat limited. These various migration patterns likely created their own cascading social and political consequences, arriving populations sometimes integrating relatively peacefully with existing communities, while other circumstances apparently produced genuine conflict, as different groups competed for increasingly scarce resources during this genuinely difficult transitional period. Genetic and archaeological research continues providing additional insight into these ancient migration patterns. Modern scientific techniques, increasingly able to trace population movements and genetic continuity or disruption across this crucial transitional period, though considerable scholarly uncertainty and ongoing debate remains regarding specific details. Understanding these migration patterns adds important human dimension to the broader Bronze Age collapse narrative, reminding us that beyond abstract political and economic disruption, this crisis involved countless individual families and communities making difficult, often desperate decisions about survival amid genuinely disrupted, uncertain circumstances. These population movements would eventually contribute to the different cultural and political landscape that gradually emerged throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East during subsequent centuries, migrant and surviving populations gradually establishing new communities and cultural patterns following this transformative ancient crisis. Chapter 26: Why Egypt Survived. Partially. Among the major Bronze Age powers, Egypt's relative survival, despite genuine internal strain and eventual long-term decline, stands out as a particularly interesting comparative case. Several specific factors likely contributing to Egypt's somewhat different experience compared to more completely collapsed neighboring kingdoms. Egypt's geographic position provided certain natural defensive advantages. The Nile Valley's relatively narrow, easily defended geography, combined with surrounding desert regions, creating natural barriers that made large-scale invasion considerably more difficult compared to the more geographically exposed coastal kingdoms throughout the broader region. Egyptian agriculture, still reliably supported by the Nile's predictable annual flooding, likely proved somewhat more resilient to the drought conditions that apparently affected other regions more severely. This agricultural stability, providing crucial food security even amid broader regional environmental and economic disruption. Egyptian military organization and resources, built up across centuries of New Kingdom power, allowed genuinely effective resistance against Sea People's invasion attempts. Ramesses III's successful military campaigns demonstrating Egypt still maintained considerable defensive capability during this crisis period. Egyptian political and administrative institutions, while certainly experiencing genuine strain, maintained greater continuity compared to kingdoms like the Hittite Empire or various Mycenaean palace states. This institutional resilience helping Egypt weather the crisis without experiencing complete governmental collapse. Despite this relative survival, Egypt experienced genuine, lasting consequences from this turbulent period: reduced international trade, weakened control over previously dominated Levantine territory, and gradually declining central political authority throughout subsequent centuries following this crisis period. Egypt's experience demonstrates that the Bronze Age collapse wasn't necessarily an all-or-nothing catastrophe, but rather produced a genuine spectrum of outcomes, some kingdoms experiencing complete collapse, others managing partial survival with significant long-term diminishment, reflecting each civilization's particular circumstances and available resources. This comparative perspective helps historians better understand the collapse's true nature, moving beyond simplistic narratives suggesting uniform, total civilizational destruction throughout the entire region, toward more nuanced understanding, acknowledging genuine variation in how different Bronze Age powers experienced and survived this widespread crisis. Egypt's partial survival, achieved through combination of geographic advantage, agricultural resilience, and military capability, offers valuable insight into what factors may have helped certain ancient societies better weather this kind of severe, multi-causal systemic crisis compared to their less fortunate contemporary neighbors. Chapter 27. Competing Theories Among Modern Historians. Contemporary historians and archaeologists continue actively debating the Bronze Age collapse's precise causes and relative importance of different contributing factors. This ongoing scholarly discussion reflecting both the genuine complexity of available evidence and continuing new archaeological discoveries. Some historians continue emphasizing Sea People's invasion as the primary causal factor, pointing toward Egyptian textual evidence and destruction patterns at numerous coastal sites as supporting this traditional interpretation that has dominated popular understanding of the collapse for many previous decades. Other scholars increasingly favor climate-focused explanations, particularly emphasizing paleoclimatic evidence for significant drought conditions, arguing environmental stress represents the fundamental underlying cause that then triggered the various other disruptions, including Sea People's migration and internal social unrest. Systems collapse theorists argue against identifying any single primary cause, instead emphasizing how multiple simultaneous pressures interacted within an highly interconnected, interdependent ancient system. This framework increasingly gaining scholarly acceptance as archaeological evidence continues revealing the crisis's genuine multi-causal complexity. Some historians specifically emphasize internal social and political factors, suggesting rebellion against increasingly strained palace authorities played a more significant role than external invasion or environmental factors alone. This perspective drawing particularly on archaeological evidence from specific Mycenaean destruction sites. Earthquake researchers continue advocating for greater recognition of seismic activity's role, arguing this natural disaster factor has been historically underemphasized compared to more dramatic, historically documented human conflict. Despite growing physical evidence supporting significant earthquake damage at numerous relevant sites, new archaeological discoveries continue refining and sometimes challenging existing theories. Ongoing excavation throughout the region regularly producing additional evidence that historians must incorporate into their broader understanding. This active research, meaning our understanding of the collapse, continues genuinely evolving even today. Scientific dating techniques and paleoclimatic research methods continue improving as well, providing increasingly precise chronological and environmental evidence that helps historians better evaluate different theoretical frameworks against increasingly detailed, scientifically grounded historical evidence. This ongoing scholarly debate, rather than representing historical uncertainty as weakness, actually demonstrates healthy, active historical inquiry. Researchers continuing to refine and improve our understanding of this genuinely complex ancient crisis through careful, ongoing archaeological and historical investigation. Chapter 28. Comparing the Bronze Age collapse to other civilizational collapses. The Bronze Age collapse, while historically unique in its specific details, shares interesting broader patterns with other significant civilizational collapses throughout human history. This comparative perspective helping historians better understand general patterns underlying complex societal breakdown across different historical periods. The later Western Roman Empire's decline, discussed extensively elsewhere, shares certain structural similarities with the Bronze Age collapse, including combined pressure from external migration and invasion, internal political instability, and economic strain, all interacting within an already highly complex, interconnected imperial system. The Maya civilization's classic period collapse, occurring considerably later in Mesoamerica, similarly involved combined environmental stress, particularly drought, alongside political fragmentation and warfare between competing city-states. This pattern echoing certain aspects of the earlier Bronze Age crisis, despite occurring in an entirely different geographic and cultural context. Archaeologist and historian Joseph Tainter's influential collapse theory, examining numerous historical civilizational breakdowns, suggests complex societies often become increasingly vulnerable to collapse, precisely as they develop greater administrative and economic complexity. This pattern potentially applying meaningfully to the Bronze Age palace economies previously discussed. Climate stress appears as a recurring factor across numerous historical collapse examples, suggesting environmental pressure frequently interacts with existing political and economic vulnerabilities, to produce cascading societal crisis, rather than climate alone, typically representing history's sole decisive causal factor. The specific pattern of trade network disruption cascading into broader systemic crisis also appears in other historical examples. Interconnected societies repeatedly showing vulnerability to this kind of cascading failure, once essential trade relationships supporting specialized economic systems become significantly disrupted. These comparative patterns don't suggest historical determinism. Different collapses obviously involved genuinely different specific circumstances, but rather help identify broader structural vulnerabilities that complex, interconnected societies across different historical periods and geographic regions may share in common. Modern scholars studying societal resilience and collapse increasingly draw upon these historical patterns, hoping to better understand what factors might help contemporary complex societies avoid similarly severe collapse when facing their own combinations of environmental, economic, and political pressure and stress. This comparative historical perspective adds valuable broader significance to Bronze Age collapse research, transforming this ancient crisis from simply an isolated historical curiosity into a genuinely instructive case study relevant for understanding complex societal vulnerability across vastly different historical periods and cultural contexts. Chapter 29: What Finally Emerged from the Ashes. Despite the Bronze Age collapse's genuine devastation, this crisis didn't represent civilization's permanent end throughout the affected regions, but rather a difficult, extended transitional period eventually giving way to new political, economic, and technological patterns characterizing the subsequent Iron Age. Iron technology, gradually spreading more widely during and after this collapse period, offered certain practical advantages over bronze, iron ore proving considerably more widely available than the geographically limited tin required for bronze production. This technological shift potentially reducing the kind of trade dependency that had contributed to Bronze Age vulnerability. New political structures gradually emerged throughout the affected regions, generally smaller and more decentralized compared to the large palace-centered kingdoms of the previous Bronze Age period, though these new political forms would eventually develop their own considerable sophistication across subsequent centuries. The Phoenicians, emerging from the Levantine coast, developed extensive maritime trade networks during this post-collapse period, their alphabetic writing system eventually spreading throughout the Mediterranean world. This Phoenician innovation, representing one of the post-collapse period's most historically significant developments. Greek civilization, following its difficult Dark Age period, eventually experienced remarkable recovery and development, adopting alphabetic writing, developing new political institutions, including early forms of democracy, and eventually producing the sophisticated classical Greek civilization that would prove enormously influential throughout subsequent Western history. Assyria gradually developed into a considerably more powerful, extensive empire during subsequent centuries, eventually achieving imperial control significantly exceeding anything accomplished during the earlier Bronze Age period, demonstrating genuine long-term political recovery and development following this earlier regional crisis. New trade networks gradually developed throughout the Mediterranean and Near East, though initially considerably reduced compared to Bronze Age levels. These networks would eventually expand again, supporting renewed economic development throughout subsequent centuries of ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern history. This eventual recovery, while genuinely difficult and requiring several centuries to fully develop, demonstrates human society's remarkable capacity for adaptation and renewal, even following genuinely severe, widespread civilizational crisis, new political and economic patterns eventually emerging from this earlier collapse's genuine difficulty and disruption. Understanding this eventual recovery provides important balance to the Bronze Age collapse narrative, reminding us that even history's most severe civilizational crises typically give way, eventually, to renewed human adaptation and development, however difficult and extended that recovery process genuinely proved to be. Chapter 30. Why this mystery still matters today. Closing chapter. As we conclude this long exploration of the Bronze Age collapse, one of ancient history's most genuinely fascinating unsolved mysteries, it's worth reflecting on why this distant 3,000-year-old crisis continues capturing serious scholarly attention and genuine popular curiosity even today. This ancient crisis offers valuable historical perspective on how sophisticated, interconnected civilizations can experience genuine vulnerability precisely because of the complexity and interdependence that also enables their prosperity, this pattern carrying meaningful relevance for understanding contemporary global interconnection and its own potential vulnerabilities. The multi-causal nature of the Bronze Age collapse, involving climate stress, trade disruption, migration, internal unrest, and possibly natural disaster, all interacting simultaneously, offers important lessons about how complex crises rarely stem from single, simple causes, but rather emerge from multiple factors compounding one another. Ongoing archaeological research continues, revealing new evidence about this ancient crisis. Each new discovery adding additional detail and sometimes challenging previous assumptions. This active, evolving scholarly investigation demonstrating how historical understanding continues genuinely developing, even regarding events occurring thousands of years in our past. The Bronze Age collapse also reminds us that historical progress isn't necessarily linear or guaranteed. Sophisticated civilizations achieving genuine cultural, economic, and technological achievement can nonetheless experience severe disruption and decline. This sobering historical lesson carrying continued relevance for understanding human civilization more broadly. Yet this ancient crisis also demonstrates genuine human resilience and adaptability. Surviving populations throughout the affected regions eventually developing new political, economic, and technological solutions. This eventual recovery offering hope alongside the collapse's genuinely sobering initial devastation and disruption. The mystery's persistent unsolved elements, including the Sea People's true origins and the precise relative importance of different contributing factors, continue motivating ongoing archaeological and historical research. This genuine scholarly uncertainty reflecting appropriate intellectual humility regarding events so distant in our shared human past. Modern historians increasingly view the Bronze Age collapse not as a simple cautionary tale, but as a genuinely complex historical case study offering nuanced insight into how interconnected societies actually function, adapt, and sometimes fail when facing combined environmental, economic, and political pressure and challenge. And so, as this long journey through one of history's most genuinely fascinating ancient mysteries finally settles toward its quiet close, let these ancient ruins, mysterious sea peoples, and desperate final letters from Ugarit's doomed scribes carry you now gently toward whatever peaceful rest awaits. This ancient puzzle's enduring mystery, offering quiet, patient company as you drift toward your own peaceful sleep tonight.